Welcome to the Surrogates Corner with James Mahan.
Hello and welcome to the Surrogates Corner with James Mahan. My name is Kevin Rosenquist. Thanks so much for being here. Today we are going to talk about the steps and considerations in choosing a surrogate. James, great to see you again.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right, so what would you say are the first three critical steps for anyone considering surrogacy?
Yeah, so there's steps on both sides for whether you're on the intended parent side or the surrogate side that are important to think about. I'll start with the IPs because that tends to be a little bit easier in terms of, there usually is a medical need. We need a surrogate for whatever reason, inability to conceive, need someone to be able to carry the baby or whatever else the other case might be. So it's kind of a medical push or medical necessity, typically to get into surrogacy. The question then becomes, what are we looking to do? How big of a family do we want to build? And a lot of it is based off of cost because these are not, cheap ventures to get into. They're expensive on the medical side. They're, a little bit expensive on the legal side, but realistically, our portion, our fraction of the pie is pretty small when you look at medical costs and insurance costs and, compensation and dealing with the surrogates payments, on their own. But that is a big issue for a lot of people is how much are we going to spend? How much can we spend? And that sometimes will dictate what kind of journey you decide to go into. The other one then becomes, what are you comfortable with, right? It's a contract and it's still like a risk tolerance exercise. Like you are going to be engaging an incredible woman who wants to be pregnant for you and carry your baby. But at the same time, you have to realize that she's the one who's pregnant and you're not going to have complete control over her. Mm-hmm. So I always recommend to intended parents, if you have particular things that you are really specific about or nuanced about that you really want your surrogate to do or to engage in, it's always good to have those conversations up front. Because if you make that known, then you can get matched with the right surrogate who's either willing or able or kind of agrees with those same type of stipulations that you want. So once you get there, then the question becomes, okay, how do I find my surrogate? And that's usually where, there's the other side of the industry that kind of takes over, but there are agencies, there are matching programs, there are concierge groups that kind of help do independent journeys. And those are all different ways that we'll say, once you've made that decision that we're going to go down the surrogacy route, how do we actually get started? And then usually, again, from there, you don't really get to the attorneys until that stuff's kind of already figured out. And then you say, great, I found the surrogate. We think we're a good match. Let's go get a contract. And that's when the legal teams kind of take over for there. On the surrogate side, deciding to be a surrogate gestational carrier, it usually comes down to you either, hopefully already have had at least one pregnancy of your own. Ideally, it was uncomplicated or there weren't any issues for you health-wise for you or baby that would be problematic. Hopefully you enjoy being pregnant because you're going to do it for somebody else. And that's a lot to ask for doing this again. And then kind of knowing what, again, the same thing as for the IPs, like what things are important to you. So I tell my surrogates, like if you have, specific things that are very, very relevant or pertinent to you, it could be like, I have to be able to travel to go, take my kids to their, travel soccer games, even though we're in a, relatively close distance to home. Or one of the big issues that comes up are things around, what does your compensation need to be? How much are you willing to get paid or not? Because that's a big cost driver and then factor for the intended parents. And then finding, the right matching mechanism for you as a surrogate. The majority of surrogates will go through an agency. There are a lot of agencies. They have very different packages in terms of how they're structured, what they offer, what their base comp will be. And that's, it's a research and due diligence exercise for the surrogate as to where you want to go. If you just throw a dartboard at a screen and like, I'll pick whatever agency I land on, there's a good chance you're going to wind up with one you're not super excited about. But there's lots of information, there's lots of chat groups and everything else about different agencies, experiences they have, what to look for, and then talking to people. Whether you talk to the agency people, some surrogates will contact me and say, hey, I'm looking at these 3 agencies, like, what do you think? Or here's the packages they have, like, what should I consider? And that's all information that was great for them to have before they kind of get to that matching process.
Is it different? Does the process differ, if somebody finds a friend that wants to be their surrogate versus going through an agency?
Yeah, so it differs drastically. I joke, I tell people, like, usually a lot of times those are what we would call altruistic arrangements. So, I've had sisters who carry for sisters. I've had cousins who carry for, their family relations. Just best friends, roommate from college who, have their 3 kids and they're going to help their, college roommate have a child of their own. Those are awesome. I love being part of those matches because, you talk about warm fuzzy law. You throw in like that someone is doing this for family or a friend. It's like when people like, donate their kidneys to, their family member. Where it gets a little bit different is usually when we do those matches, we tend to not go through an agency. So usually it's just, hey, the parents like, I need a surrogate. I have one. She's my cousin. She's totally on board. We're ready to go. We just need to sign something so the doctor can send us, give her the embryo. It's like, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that because, it's just like Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner when things get brought up that people don't agree about. Like it's great until it's not. And that's where we try to make sure there's still that framework as to who is represented by whom, who gets to make certain decisions. Sometimes that's where there are cases, and this is by no means either recommended or I tell my surrogates, like if someone tells you that one lawyer is going to represent both the parents and you because you know each other and it's going to be okay, run. Like that is not a situation you want to be in. Because you want to make sure that you're protected, that you know what you're getting yourself into. And the lawyer really doesn't want to be there because they don't want to be playing both sides. Because that's a huge conflict of interest that we just don't want to deal with on our side either. So those ones tend to be different. They usually wind up being a lot cheaper because usually the surrogate then is doing it for minimal costs or just reimbursement. They're not getting quote unquote paid to do the surrogacy journey a lot of times. So that winds up being an economically more attractive option. But the problem is that the vast majority of people don't have a ready, willing, and able, female relative or close friend who's say, sure, I'll jump on a pregnancy for you because that seems like fun. So that's, a harder part to do.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point about the, it's always perfect till it's not. And it's sort of like friends or relatives going into business together. I don't want to make it seem like it's not a wonderful gesture because it is, but also it is sort of a business arrangement. And everyone goes into business with a friend going, we're besties. We're never going to have any problems. And you just never know.
Things get exacerbated. And then once you have that background, if you're at arm's length and you're dealing with someone, it's like, hey, we disagree transactionally. A lot of times it's like, I disagree with you or okay, but we're disagreeing over an issue. When there's family or there's blood or there's other kind of stuff and history there, like it becomes personal. And that's when things tend to get ugly, right? It's like, I don't trust you. I've never trusted you. Like, oh boy, here we go. We're back to 12 years old where we just, are name calling people and we're not even talking about what the actual issue may or may not be.
Yeah, for sure. Are there certain factors that intended parents and surrogates should consider when entering into a surrogate agreement?
Yeah, a lot of them, like I said, usually I joke and say the A, B, C, D are kind of just no-brainers, right?
Yeah.
We're going to get you pregnant. It's going to be our embryo. You're not going to be genetically connected to the baby. We hope you carry baby as long as possible. But once it's here, we're going to take it. We're going to name it. We're going to take it home. You're not going to have any obligations. There's no custody. There's no financial support, any of that kind of stuff. You're just going to help us build our family. Like that part's easy. Like everybody gets that across the board. Where you kind of want to start digging into is, like I said, what things are specific to you as intended parents, or on the surrogate side, it's like if the parent has specific criteria or requirements or things they want to do, like, are you okay with that? Most of those come around, medical testing or medical decision-making. Because the vast majority of times, the contract's essentially going to say the surrogate will do her best to take care of her body in the pregnancy. She'll get her doctor's, advice on what they're going to do and follow those recommendations. It's usually in the areas where it's not quote unquote doctor recommended, but parent requested, that we see things kind of getting a little bit dicey in terms of what do we do or what do we not do. Mm-hmm. So, there are cases where some parents are just nervous because, they've had multiple miscarriages or whatever the case might be, and they want to make sure that this baby is, as healthy and free of problems as possible. It's like, well, they may want to do an amniocentesis at week 13, even though there's no markers for it at all, because they just want that reassurance. Well, that may not be medically recommended, and the surrogate may or may not want to go through that unless they're okay with it because they understand that's just a really big kind of psychological piece for the intended parents. The other one that tends to come up a lot, and it's got obviously a lot more tricky when the whole Roe v. Wade decision got overturned, was what do we do if there's a problem with the pregnancy, right? The lovely thing about surrogacy is there really are no unplanned pregnancies. Each of these is calendared, it's hoped for, it's prayed for, it's paid for. Like these are not things where we're worried about someone getting pregnant, unwillingly or not wanting to continue the pregnancy. There are conditions where the pregnancy is problematic either for the carrier or for the child. The contracts will always say if there's a medical issue with the surrogate where their doctor recommends terminating or eliminating the pregnancy because of the risk to her, then that's a decision she gets to make. Now, granted, depending on where you are surrogate, like that might be harder to do based off of the state laws that you're kind of living under.
Right.
The part that usually comes into play for us is what do the parents want to do? And, a lot of parents, rightfully so, want to and are hoping for a perfect baby. Like we all want perfectly healthy, happy babies. when we have them. We don't always get that, unfortunately. And then the question becomes, okay, well, who decides if there is an issue? What kind of an issue does it have to be? And how long do we have to make that decision? That unfortunately winds up being a big issue. And the problem that I see a lot is that a lot of times the question is asked to surrogate, like, if there's a medical problem with the baby and the parents are requesting to terminate, are you willing to do that? And it just becomes like a yes, no. There's not a lot of nuance to it. And when we get into the contract, we lawyers like flesh that out a whole lot. Like, what kind of things rise to the level of being a termination request? Who has to sort of approve it if it's a medical issue or not? Where can we go and have a procedure done, especially if we live in a state that has very restrictive abortion rules? Can you go somewhere else or not? And then how long in the pregnancy can we be when we're willing to do that? A lot of these are things that, we haven't really thought about before we get to contract, and that kind of make important decisions one way or the other. So that's one of those areas where I say parents and surrogates, you want to be very upfront about what your views are. Because I have some surrogates who are adamantly pro-life and they don't want to terminate the pregnancy, even if their life is at risk and they're on the table too. Like, they're like, I just not what I'm going to do. All for it. Great. But we want to make sure that whoever you're matched with is going to be, ideologically aligned with you for that. Or on the flip side, like if the parents are really nervous because they have a lot of issues in family history or genetically that might be problems, and there is a legit concern that we might have to terminate a pregnancy because of a medical problem, you want to make sure that your surrogate is kind of on board with that and willing to let you make those calls. Because the issue we run into and I don't mean to drone on about the termination kind of issue, but it's one of the big ones that comes up, because that's the other big fear is like,
absolutely,
if something happens and she terminates, can I stop her? Or if I want her to terminate and she refuses, can I force her? Mm-hmm. And the truth is, no, you can't on either side. So, there's no law that's going to say, oh, you get an injunction against that surrogate. She can't terminate her pregnancy because the contract says she can't do it. Good luck. The other side of that is you can't drag a woman in and make her have a termination if she doesn't want to. So even if there is a medical problem, it's bad and you know it and she knows it, if she doesn't want to do it, you can't really do anything about it. And our contracts will say that. They'll say like, this is what everybody intends. And usually either the last paragraph of the termination section or the very first one says, but just to be aware, nothing in this contract can actually force them. And it's highly probable that this provision may be unenforceable if a court or jurisdiction decides that they don't want to go along with it. So it's definitely one of those meeting of the minds moments where we want to make sure that people are aware of kind of what they're agreeing to or wanting to do. Because if we can get past that hurdle, then a lot of the other ones are easier to work through, like testing and screening and specialist appointments. Like, those are just kind of nuanced a little bit. But if we get an issue of like, I want to terminate for this, and I have some surrogates who are like, I will not terminate for Down syndrome, or I will not terminate for other type deals. Like, again, that is fine, but make sure that everybody knows what we're saying we're going to do, so that we don't get to contract and then have it break apart because of a ideological divide. Yeah,
there's so many things that the average person wouldn't think about. I mean, it's definitely an interesting area of law. How do you ensure that all the parties are legally protected throughout the process? Yeah, so the biggest goal is, we do the contract, but again, the contract is only as good as the paper it's written on and what's actually in it. So, a lot of times this area of law is very small. The number of lawyers who practice, across the board is compared to like, a typical divorce attorney or a, car accident attorney where there's like just, numerous and they're proliferate everywhere. You want to work with attorneys who know what they're doing and know what kind of should be in the contracts and what probably shouldn't be. A lot of times, if you're going with an agency or kind of a match, you're going to find an attorney who kind of specializes in this field. I do see some cases where, someone's like, oh, well, my best friend from college went to law school and they're an attorney, they do contracts, so they're going to draft it for me. It's like, okay, that might work. But if they've never seen a surrogacy contract, there's probably going to be a lot of stuff that they're not going to think of to put in, because a lot of them are stuff that I tell my surrogates, like, this provision is in here because somebody screwed it up at one point in time. And now we're trying to minimize it or correct for it. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's one big thing, is going to lawyers who kind of know what they're doing or have experience in this. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, like, you're a contract lawyer. Great. Have you ever done a surrogacy contract? And if they say no, well, it's kind of like saying, I'm going to go to a surgeon to do brain surgery who works on feet. It's like, well, that's, they might be a doctor, but that doesn't mean they have expertise or kind of familiarity with what we're looking for and what we want to be in there to make sure that everybody is protected. Yeah. The other one that kind of comes into play is that you want to make sure that both sides have their own attorney, right? And this is generally true across the board. If you ever work with an agency who says you don't need a second attorney, switch agencies. Most of them do. The states that have laws on surrogacy almost universally require it. So that part is big in terms of what we're able to do for both sides.
But you also want to make sure that you have the protections you want, because like I said, the contract is usually going to be drafted by the intended parent's attorney. They're going to kind of get the first crack at it. They're going to use their standard form or their standard template to begin with, and then modify it as kind of the unique picadillos and stuff that the intended parents want. And then it goes to the surrogate and says, hey, here's our proposed contract. What do you think? And that's where we tend to go. And that's, where I come in and say, okay, this is what is in here. I tend to highlight the contract for my surrogates because I said, it's one thing to just say, here's a 70-page contract. Let me know if you have questions. It's like, well, that's terrible. Like I couldn't imagine, someone just dropping me like an M&A contract and saying, let me know if you have questions at the end. So I tend to go through and highlight it and explain the big important stuff or the things that I want to make sure that as they're going through it, whether they're reading it in depth or skimming it, that they're at least seeing, so that we can talk about those issues because they tend to come up more often than not. But making sure that you have that representation, again, when you need it, and realistically, when things may go wrong is one of the issues that I work with at the Surrogates Corner to try and make sure is kind of just a universal for my clients. So in the legal world, we usually are doing this in two chunks, the contract phase and then the parentage phase. Generally we have both sides being represented by two different attorneys at both areas, with the exception of parentage in some cases, because there are some jurisdictions where just one person can file it on behalf of like joint petitioners and they don't need a second attorney for that. It's not adversarial, so we're not really concerned there. The contract is really where we're like making sure that people know what they're doing and getting themselves into. And that, especially when we're in the journey, is where the surrogates want to know that they have help when they need it. Because like I said, the contract phase is like the honeymoon phase. Like, yes, we're all excited. We're going to have a baby. Everything's going to be great. And then it turns into like, we had a failed transfer. Whose fault is it? Like, who did or didn't do something they're not supposed to? People start trying to figure out who's to blame for certain things.
And
that's usually where it's like, okay, well, do I have the help that I need? And, what I saw and what I don't, begrudgingly say this against the other attorneys, is that we are usually hired to do the one of each of the phases, but not like everything in between. So a lot of times, the reviewing attorneys, who can be people who work with intended parents and surrogates, will usually say, I'm just going to represent you for the contract phase. And once you sign it, like my job as educator and counselor is kind of over until you get to parentage phase, which leaves the surrogates in kind of a tricky position of, well, what do I do and who do I go to if there is an issue and I don't feel like I'm getting answers or the help that I need? And comes the Surrogates Corner, where it's like, I want you to know that when those issues come up and when things do happen, whether they're small or big, that you can come to me and you're not going to be stuck paying, an hourly bill for all the questions that you have, because most of my surrogates are not in a financial position to pony up that for each time that they need a question answered, and I don't want them to. Like, I want them to know that they can have that peace of mind. Like, I can go to James with any question I need, and I'm going to get the help in, real time for it. And I'm not going to be stuck with the bill at the end of it.
I think that's really cool, because it is like, there's so many questions that I'm sure these women have, and sure there's Google and there's ChatGPT and you can ask questions and all that. It's a lot different to sit down, whether it's on a Zoom call, a phone, or in person, and actually talk to someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah. And the other issue that we also see, Kevin, is that, like every agency is a little bit different and every contract's a little bit different. So you may go to a Facebook chat group and someone says, oh, well, on my journey, we did it this way. It's like, that's great, but that's not in your contract.
Right.
So, part of it comes down to like, what issue is going on? Let's get to your contract and see what does it specifically say we do or don't have to do, or, where this should kind of fall out. And let's make sure we're kind of acting in accordance with whatever that is going to be, not just with like, well, somebody recommended I don't do this. That's fine, but that may not be, the components or the confines of what you're dealing with, because your contract is is most likely and assuredly will be different from theirs.
And that's a good preview. Next episode, we're going to talk about some of the common issues in surrogacy and how to avoid them. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Surrogates Corner with James Mahan. If you'd like to get in touch with James, the website is surrogatescorner.com. You can also find him on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We love having you here. James, so good to see you again. Looking forward to talking with you again.
Likewise. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.